Hello, everyone. Welcome to this British Columbia Social Procurement Initiative member webinar on incorporating the Accessible BC Act into local government procurement. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Trish Kelly, Managing Director of Untapped Accessibility, and Keely Kidner, Equity and Inclusion Coordinator for the District of Squamish. My name is Tori Williamson, and I'm the COO of Bisocial Canada and the Training and Resources Lead for BCSBI. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and learn on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral Squamish territory. I endeavor to make this more than just words and invite you to consider what it means to live on the traditional lands in your community and what efforts we can all take to repair and improve our relations with Indigenous people locally and globally. We have live captioning for the session provided by Susan Thomas. Please turn on CC or captioning by going to the more, 3 little dots, then selecting captions, and then selecting show captions, or click on the link that Susan has shared in the chat to view the captions in another window. This session will be recorded and the slides will be available to BCSBI members in the BCSBI member home. Just a little refresh for those who are new or learning about BCSBI. It is an initiative where we work with local governments and institutions to build capacity through training, like this session, consulting, resources, and all other types of support to implement purchasing that achieves community goals. We recognize the potential that social procurement has to support local governments and communities, and really want to center all of our economic activities on ways to build community well-being and resilience. And I think that's going to be really interesting to look at how we can incorporate procurement and accessibility in this conversation today. BCSBI has over 40 members from across the province, ranging from small local governments all the way up to some larger crown corporations. Each member community has their own unique circumstances, but we take a collaborative approach here at BCSBI and really try to share our learnings and support each other in each organization's journey towards social procurement. I already mentioned the BCSBI member home. So for all BCSBI members, that is your one-stop shop for everything that you need to help with your social procurement journey. Things like the massive webinar library, templates, guides, training, all sorts of things can be found there. And if you're having any difficulty finding anything, please feel free to reach out to myself or Rob Fisher from the BCSBI team. We're thrilled to share some updated impact at a glance for our soon to be released annual impact report. So as I mentioned, we've got over 40 participating organizations. Over 1,000 individuals have come to training sessions and webinars. There's been over $700 million in social procurement spend across the members and over 1,000 procurement projects that have incorporated social value. So amazing to see this progress, and we're only just taking off. There's so much more to come as we continue to explore social procurement. Today, we're joined by Trish Kelly, Managing Director of Untapped Accessibility, and Keely Kidner, Equity and Inclusion Coordinator for the District of Squamish. As we go into our conversations and presentations today, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we will have time for Q&A at the end. So a quick little bit about our speakers before they do maybe some more fulsome introductions. The District of Squamish is a BCSBI member with a fantastic social procurement policy. They have also been municipal leaders in BC for responding to the Accessible BC Act. So we're lucky to be joined by Keely today to hear more about what they're doing in Squamish. Untapped Accessibility is a certified social enterprise, which helps organizations deliver on accessibility. Whether your organization is taking action in response to accessibility legislation, or you see accessibility as a business imperative, Untapped Accessibility can help. Services include planning, community engagement, and accessibility awareness training. So now I'll hand it over to Trish to share more insights with us. Welcome, Trish.
Thanks so much. Ooh, hi. Hello, everyone. So glad to be with you today. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm also logging in from the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation from my home office in downtown Squamish. So we have a good representation of Squamish here today. And part of how I had the opportunity to invite Keely to be part of this session today is that I'm also a member of the Squamish Accessibility Committee that Keely invited me to join. I'm really looking forward to this conversation that we're going to have today. I wanted to share that in addition to being an accessibility advocate through my work at Untapped Accessibility, that I also wanted to note that I am I'm also someone who, at this stage of my life, I don't identify as having a disability, although I was raised by my mother who had multiple disabilities, and so I'm what's called a child of a disabled parent. And I do this work in part in service of her memory. So my mom lost her hearing in her 40s, and it impacted her ability to maintain her work. So as she was dealing with her life transition of becoming comfortable with being a person without hearing, she was trying to get back into the workforce, and there were some barriers that she encountered there. And so I did this work in part to honor her memory, and I approached this work with the joy and hope that technology and other aspects of how we handle disability in our society have shifted since my mom's attempt to get back into the workforce. And there's many more ways for people with disabilities to have equal participation in all aspects of our society. So that I just wanted to share that. I also want to acknowledge that my mom was a Métis woman, and so I am proud to uh, also share with you that that's part of my identity and informs how I approach the intersectionality of accessibility and disability work. Keely, would you like a chance to introduce yourself before I move into the slides?
Sure, that would be great. Hello, everyone. My name is Keely. My pronouns are she, they, and I work at the District of Squamish as the Equity and Inclusion Coordinator. And yes, I come at disability from an interesting perspective as well. I ended up losing my hearing in probably the last decade, I'd say, maybe even earlier. I was in denial for quite a while. But yeah, so I use captioning and I have, have some lived experience in some of the barriers that are around for folks who have disabilities. But I really appreciate what you say, Trish, about doing this in your mother's memory and, the joy and excitement. This is a really exciting time to be engaging with disability and accessibility. And yeah, there's a lot of joy to be had in making things more accessible. So yeah, I'm joining you as well from the unceded territory of Squamish Nation, representing Squamish here. I'm just up from downtown, but yeah, looking forward to chatting more about what we're doing and trying to do here at the District of Squamish. I'll pass it back to you, Trish. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm just bringing up my slide deck now, and we'll get started here with the presentation. So the purpose of our session today is to help you as procurement professionals to understand the Accessible BC Act that received royal assent in 2021, and how it applies to procurement now, as well as how it will likely impact your work in the future. We've got a pretty tight amount of time together, just your lunch hour. Thanks for joining us during your lunch hour. I'm going to go over some of the background of the legislation and key concepts, and then also how it shows up in terms of procurement before we have a bit of a case study of where we hear from Keely about what the District of Squamish is doing to address accessibility and social procurement. And we do want to have time at the end for 15 minutes for Q&A with you. So you're welcome to add questions into the chat as we go, and also know that we are aiming to have space for your questions at the end. Hoping to get a little bit of engagement going here and warm up your fingers for using the chat. Wonder if you're willing to take a guess at what percentage of Canadians have a disability. Wondering, are we seeing it? We've got some responses coming in. Okay, so we've got a guess of 30%, 10%, 20. Ooh, quite a few 20s. Some 28s. Okay, so thank you so much. Thanks for your participation. I see we've got lots of guesses here. And I'll just imagine a drum roll as I move to the next slide and let you know what the actual answer is. So the answer is 1 in 5 Canadians have at least one disability. So these are stats from the Canadian Survey on Disability. And that's a large percentage of the people in Canada that have at least one disability. So we're talking about a group of equity deserving folks, but when you think about who you're serving in local government, it's 1 in 5 of your community members may be dealing with at least one disability. I'm going to go through a little bit of key terminology that I think is important for us to cover. And some of these terms have, we might have an understanding of them from maybe a more historical context, but I want to make sure that you understand how we're talking about these things, not only today, but also in the legislation itself. So within the Accessible BC Act, the way that a disability is described is a disability is what happens when a person with a health condition or impairment comes into contact with a barrier. It's that intersection of someone with a health condition coming up against a barrier that results in disability and prevents that person from having equal participation with others in society. So that's pretty different than what we might have thought of in the past, where it would have been, oh, a disability is really just a health condition that a person has. But this is kind of underpinned by a new perspective on disability that relates to accessibility and the Act itself. I also wanted to flag that when we're talking about disability in BC, we're talking about a definition of disability that is more than what you may have originally thought of when you saw accessible parking sign that had a stick person in a using a wheelchair. We're not just talking about physical disabilities, although that is still part of the definition. The definition of disability has broadened to also include mental health conditions, as well as neurodevelopmental conditions, learning disorders, cognitive disabilities, and some of these might be a bit of new information for you. So although it's not just about the health condition, it's important to realize that when we're thinking about accessibility, we're not just thinking about physical accessibility for people who have mobility related disability, but we can be thinking about how someone who has a sensory related disability or perhaps autism or sensory sensitivities might be need to have their access needs considered as well. Also wanted to highlight that the word accessibility has had some pretty general applications in our society, but when we're talking about accessibility in the Accessible BC Act, what we're talking about is the work that we do to ensure that people with disabilities can participate equally with others. So that's very important to note that the term, making something accessible or having good access outside of the context of the legislation might also include other types of considerations for other equity seeking groups, but we're really talking about people with disabilities in this context. And the Act itself does define what is a barrier. So for the purposes of the Accessible BC Act, a barrier is anything that hinders the full and equal participation of a person with an impairment. And I would say that barriers result when our design processes don't really properly consider the inherent diversity and variation of the human condition. And so that's probably true in a lot of cases for how we've designed our society for, for decades previous. So there's work to do to shift this and remove and identify barriers, which is part of what the Accessible BC Act is prompting local governments and other public sector organizations to do. So the types of barriers that we're talking about in the Accessible BC Act do include those physical ones. So looking at the barriers that might be created and how we design buildings or parks or other public spaces, as well as the attitudes that we may bring to the work. So the stereotypes that perhaps a planner believes, or someone that's working on a program, the assumptions that a program manager may have about what a person can do or what they can't do, and what we assume is best for others is another type of attitudinal barrier that, if we're not digging into that and understanding where it's coming from, can get in the way for people with disabilities. Policies as well can be a pretty juicy area in terms of where barriers come up. So if we're designing programs and policies without thinking about accessibility, that can create barriers, as well as the general rules that we create. Communication and technology is another area where we see barriers coming up. So the way that we design websites, the ways that we share information, those are all types of barriers that are named right in the Accessible BC legislation. There are a couple other areas as well, including transportation and health and education related barriers, but these are the ones that feel the most relevant to the work that you're doing in your organizations. So the Accessible BC Act was received royal assent in 2021. The goal of it is to create that inclusive environment and remove barriers for British Columbians with disabilities. And it's an important piece of enabling legislation. So it gives the green light for further standards and requirements to come in the future. But this first stage is pretty limited in its scope in terms of what the requirements are. So there are two deadlines. The first one just passed, and that was for local governments as well as the education sector and some others. Health authorities and some of the Crown agencies and tribunals have until next September. So hopefully they'll be learning from what's been going on for you and for other subsectors as they implement these requirements. The requirements are pretty simple in terms of what is required at this stage for local governments. But when you unpack them, of course, there's more complexity there. But it's three things: create an accessibility committee, an accessibility plan, and create some sort of process for receiving feedback from the public about barriers that they experience when interacting with your organization. So just a little bit more detail about each of those three requirements. The plan itself, I think the most important thing is that it will need to be publicly available. So for most local governments, that would be posting it on the website. It has to be updated every 3 years, and it should be outlining how the organization is going to find and remove barriers to accessibility. So that's pretty thin on detail. I've definitely heard through presentations I've done at LGMA and other places that many local governments would have liked it to be more detailed in what the requirements are, but government has said that they try to be, as flexible as possible and allow organizations to work from their strengths and build on the work they're already doing. So they kept it quite vague, I guess we could say. So that's really all that is required in the legislation. The committee, there are some requirements around the representation at that committee. So for example, the intent is that half the members of the committee are people that either have a disability themselves or represent a disability support organization. So the goal is to really center people with lived experience of disability in the work. And some organizations have made that a completely internal committee where it's just made up of staff. Others have invited community members to be part of it, which makes sense for a local government to be considering the voices of citizens in their local community. Also, one member must identify as Indigenous, and the purpose of that committee is to give advice on the accessibility plan. So they come hand in hand along with the accessibility plan. And then the feedback mechanism is, again, pretty thin on details. Most organizations have turned it into some kind of online form, but it could be lower tech than that as well. It just needs to be a way for members of the public to tell you about barriers they've experienced when interacting with your organization or what they've witnessed when others are interacting with you. And the goal of that feedback, again, is to feed into the next iteration of your plan. So it should be considered and likely seen by the accessibility committee as well, so that they can weigh in and give you their perspective on what kind of priority it might represent, how pressing an issue it is. So in addition to those three criteria, like really what we're talking about is that next stage, things will get more detailed and more prescriptive. So there will be standards. They're named in the legislation itself. They name 8 areas and then say there could be others. But the two that are already in development are an accessible employment standard and an accessible service delivery standard. Those two, there are technical committees launched by government that are already working on a draft, which will likely go out for public feedback, probably I'd say a year to 2 years from now. Then beyond that, the built environment, there will be some kind of implications for standards, whether that's into the building code or it's a set, it's on its own as piece of requirements or recommendations. There also will be impacts for information and communications. And you can see there I highlighted procurement is one that was named. So obviously government itself is thinking about procurement and how accessible procurement will play into creating that equal access for people with disabilities. So that's probably when we will see the,
Trish, your audio just cut out for me. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Trish, can you hear me? Okay. Oh, it looks like maybe she lost her internet potentially. I don't see her on the screen anymore. Okay. Let's see if she will potentially pop back. Keely, you look like you might be messaging her or Emma. Okay, Emma's nodding. Great. Sorry, everybody. We will see if Trish can join in 1 minute here. Otherwise, maybe we can hear what Keely has to say, although I think there's going to be a little bit of a one building on the other. So hopefully we can send Trish lots of internet technology, good vibe mojo. So her system can start to connect here. Okay.
Hi.
Oh,
Hello.
hi. You're back. I can hear you. Great news.
Okay. That's great. Wow, what a shock. I saw this spinner going and so rare that happens. I didn't even know what it meant at first. I had to wrap my head around that.
Well, we're glad you're back. I'm glad I was sending you lots of good internet vibes, so I think that's what helped.
Thank you. That definitely helped. Okay, I'll pull up the slide deck again.
Sounds great. Thanks, Trish.
Did I at least go out on a really like good cliffhanger? Are you just as I said the term procurement?
Yeah, pretty much. That was the mic drop. Everybody was like, oh, edge of the seats, procurement, what next?
Okay. Okay, so and I guess I should turn my camera back on. There we go. Hi, everybody. Glad to rejoin you. So I was saying that procurement is named as one of the coming standards. So of course, eventually that will have implications for you as procurement professionals. But I also imagine that as employment and service delivery standards come about, you're going to have, HR and other departments knocking on your door to say, how can we actually address accessibility in our next, our next purchase or our next RFP that we put out. So, so it will come for you sooner than that. So be prepared. So I wanted to go into a little bit of detail of some of the whys this work it is important and why it should be on your radar, not just because of the Accessible BC Act, but obviously the fact that they've named a procurement standard, that there are procurement implications for all the other standard areas. It's going to come to you for sure. But also I think that accessibility aligns with the social procurement goals that you have in terms of supplier diversity when looking at developing services, infrastructure, and goods that will work for all citizens, including the 1 in 5 that we already know has at least one disability. I think accessibility and procurement will help you to ensure that your supplier community reflects the diversity of the BC population. Not only does it serve the broadest number of people possible, but is as representative as possible. And I would say that from an advocacy perspective, I think that local governments have an opportunity to create demand for significant categories like information communication technology just by asking about accessibility from suppliers. So that's a powerful way to get their ears perked up. And there's also, I think, a really great opportunity to influence unemployment rates for one of the largest equity deserving groups that we have in our communities. Some examples of how procurement could show up even before it comes to that procurement standard, as I was chatting with Keely and we were, brainstorming some of the ways that this shows up, looking at the accessibility of the EV charging stations that your community may be installing, that next website or those online forums that you're developing, checking the accessibility about them and setting that in requirements. Looking at the programming in rec centers, for example, to ensure that there are sensory friendly pool hours for neurodivergent kids and their families. Looking at that next facilities build. And one other thing I was wanting to flag, this is my own little personal story from being on the accessibility committee at the District of Squamish. Keely organized a scroll about, which was, let's look at the website for the District of Squamish and look at the accessibility of it. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole of the Voyant alert system that we use in Squamish that notifies us about evacuation notices and that sort of thing. And I wondered, how accessible is that? So I played around a little bit to see the accessibility of their website, thought through, okay, this gives a text notification. How accessible is that to people that may have different types of disabilities? And I reached out to Voyant Alert and I said, hey, do you have the capability to create an accessible version of the Voyant Alert website for a community, or to ensure that it's accessible to people with disabilities? And they said, oh yeah, we've done that before. They just need to tell us they want that. And so that was really powerful to me, because if you know to ask for it, it may be that, especially if a company has been working in Ontario where they've had accessibility legislation for decades, that software company may have experience with developing accessible products. And if you ask for it, they can turn on those features. So that's my little personal story around how it can show up. Some of the challenges, though, with the work that around accessibility that I wanted to flag. So there isn't one certifier or approach when it comes to verifying for accessibility. So accessibility, it looks to improve representation of people with disabilities in all aspects of society, including workforce participation and technical accessibility products and infrastructure. But there's no one certifier because it's going in several different directions. Disability is also still such a significant grounds for discrimination and exclusion that even if you decide that, okay, we're going to prioritize disability-owned businesses, for example, in our procurement practices, that might be challenging to actually get all of the suppliers that you need because it's still risky for people with disabilities to out themselves in terms of their disability in professional environments. But there are a lot of opportunities. So people with disabilities are one of the largest equity deserving communities. And so having that opportunity to ensure that there's representation of them in your supplier diversity is important. And there is an opportunity for impact because disabled people experience rates of unemployment that can be as much as double what they are for people in the same age group that don't have disabilities. So by prioritizing working with organizations that employ people with disabilities, you have an opportunity to impact that unemployment number. In terms of how it can improve services for communities, if you're ensuring that 20% of the population has access to the same opportunity for full and equal participation, it improves the lives of 1 in 5 people in your community, but also their families and friends. So for example, thinking through that idea of sensory friendly pool hours, that doesn't only touch the individuals with disabilities, but also their friends and family that might want to come with them and can't otherwise be included. And then also just looking at improving access to your services, your programs and facilities in a local government is something that you can impact through your RFP process. One other aspect I wanted to flag, because I know we're thinking definitely about procurement and that outside focus, but I also noted that there's an impact for public sector employees, so you and your colleagues. So in 2022, people with disabilities were more likely to work in the public sector compared to people without disabilities. And especially when you dig into the subsectors there, healthcare, social assistance, educational services, and public admin, in all cases, there is a higher higher percentage of people with disabilities. So when you improve accessibility by supporting, let's say, your HR team in acquiring software that is accessible for their application process for jobs or their applicant tracking system, it can improve the accessibility for 1 in 5 of your colleagues or even higher. I mentioned that there isn't one key certifier that can tell you, yes, this company is not only disability owned, but prioritizes employing people with disabilities and also creates accessible products. So those are different aspects that you'll need to consider in terms of how you apply accessibility to procurement. But by Social Canada, on their website, they list over 40 certified social enterprises that have a mandate to employ people with disabilities. Additionally, there is a listing called the Pledge to Measure in BC, which tracks who's committed to measuring and reporting publicly the number of employees that self-identify as having a disability. So you'll see many Crown agencies and other public sector organizations have made that commitment and made that public commitment, which you can follow up on. Small Business BC about a year ago launched a directory of small businesses that are disability owned in BC. And nationally, the Inclusive Workplace and Supply Council of Canada, they certify firms that are either owned by veterans or persons with disabilities. So there are some sources out there for you to get a sense of what the supplier community might look like. Accessibility procurement is a huge area of opportunity. It gets very technical quite quickly, and we could definitely spend a couple hours talking about that. But I did want to give you just a little bit of guidance and some hyperlinks in terms of how you can understand what you need to ask for when you're looking for accessible software. So one thing is that there is an internationally developed set of standards that have been adopted by many governments around the world called the WCAG standards. So you can ask for WCAG standard compliance in your requirements. You can also ask a company to provide an accessibility conformance report, an ACR or a VPAT, which was started in the US to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it will tell you about what is accessible and what's not accessible about a particular kind of software. And also you can look at developing an accessible ICT policy. So there's a very good resource that I've shared here, Guide to Adopting an ICT Accessibility Procurement Policy from the Smart Cities for All toolkit. So I'll tell you just a tiny bit about the WCAG, because I know that comes up a lot. The Canadian government, in terms of the Accessible Canada Act, has made a commitment to having their website be WCAG 2.0 AA levels. So they've made a commitment. I imagine that here in BC that we'll see a commitment from the government here. So these standards are developed as part of an international collaboration with experts in accessibility. It's hosted by a nonprofit called W3C. And they're backwards compatible. So for example, the Canadian government has adopted 2.0. They did that a couple of years ago. When 2.1 came out, it's all the same stuff plus a series of additional pieces. So there's an additional 17 elements that if the Canadian government wants to get to 2.1, they have to do 17 more things to make it accessible, make their website accessible. So if you make a commitment to a certain level, you can always upgrade in the future when you have the capacity. And this is getting towards handing it over to Keely, but who is doing accessible procurement? The Canadian government's Public Services and Procurement Canada has an accessible procurement resource center that you can visit that has some very interesting tools there that you can check out. As well, the BC government, I wanted to flag this, has actually in their own accessibility plan flagged that they want to continue to incorporate accessibility criteria into procurement and policies and practices. So they're planning to do it themselves, and hopefully will be very generous with what they share around what they've decided to do and any templates and tools. And the District of Squamish, which is my really graceful segue over to Keely. So Keely, I'll let you take it from here in terms of sharing some more information with us about what's happening at Squamish.
Thanks so much, Trish. Yeah, so here at the District of Squamish, we are starting some work on accessibility and procurement. I think as I go through some of the examples of what we're doing, you'll probably realize that you might also be doing accessibility and procurement already, because sometimes it shows up in ways that you don't always think. Just before I get into the social procurement work, I just wanted to give everyone a bit of a grounding of where we came from, where we started from here at the district. So when the Accessible BC Act came into effect, we did not have an accessibility committee. We did not have an accessibility plan. I know some communities were already ahead of the game on that. I know Kamloops, Vancouver, Victoria, Whistler already had plans. But we kind of started from the ground up. So we developed our committee and our plan, and we didn't really have anything official before that. One of the next steps that we took was, in the development of the plan was taking a look at what we have already, because, doing a bit of a scan of your own organization, you might find that there's already work being done. The last thing you want to do is put something in a plan that's already been done by another department. So we took a look at that, and the procurement policy came up. So our social procurement policy was developed right in the middle of the pandemic in December of 2020. Like many organizations, I'm sure, folks recognize this, that when the pandemic happened, things kind of paused, things slowed down a lot. And it really gave us, our staff, the time to work on some of those things that were sitting on the back burner, and reviewing our procurement policy was one. So a bit of a silver lining there, we were able to update the procurement policy to include a social procurement lens. And this was done by, I just want to give a shout out to Anthony Jeffrey, who might be on the call today, and Tristan Rayner from the District of Squamish. Both were working on this and bringing it through. So what I did was took just a quick look. I did a cursory search for the word accessibility in our policy, and it comes up in some of the definitions around equity deserving groups and supplier diversity. So it's already there, but there are possibly some more opportunities to bring it to the fore. So looking at some of the successes of this policy since it's come in, we've had a lot of projects that have used this lens, especially in the supplier diversity criteria aspect. And we've actually even had some suppliers bid on projects based on the fact that we have the social procurement principles. So people are looking at it and very interested in it. We do have some challenges. A big thing is moving beyond the supplier diversity angle and building the social impact into the actual project themselves, into the deliverables. We're also fairly small. We have a pretty small supplier pool, which means, that diversity can be hard to come by. But, these are things that we're learning as we continue to work through with this policy. Next slide, please, Trish. So what are some of the opportunities to include accessibility? So Trish has already talked about a few of them. So supplier diversity, you can look at businesses supporting people with disabilities, employing people with disabilities. You can look at businesses that are owned or operated by people with disabilities. Another one is procuring accessible goods and services. So there's an opportunity here to make sure that any new purchase, development, building, system is fully accessible. And this is actually a great way to future-proof. So as Trish mentioned, there's a lot of new standards coming down. And if you're able to get ahead of that and make sure that what you're doing now is fully accessible, you're going to be able to get ahead of those standards. And actually, I'll just do a shout out. We've got some live captioning happening right now, and this is a good example of accessible procurement in action. The other big thing is staff training and awareness. So again, as Trish mentioned, those different barriers for people with disabilities, I've heard a lot. The biggest one is attitudes. And this is a great way to kind of address that throughout your organization. So this is good across the board as a way to get staff to use the lens of accessibility when they're developing projects. You can do so much as procurement specialists, but to really, get everyone thinking about this. And the great thing about this is this step can be taken at any time. You don't have to wait for a project to start or to get funding. For the most part, you can, start learning now and, make sure you take advantage of any of those opportunities like today's opportunity that come across your inbox. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about a couple of examples of things that we are doing right now. Like I said, we're just starting to review the procurement policy with a lens of accessibility. But, when I started talking to folks about this, I realized that, there's a lot that's happening already. So the biggest one is, and for those who have been to Squamish or living in Squamish, this is a very exciting project, a splash park. This has been a long time coming here. And this splash park RFP is out. There's a link to it right now. And you can actually see the title of it is an accessible splash park and playground. So it's not just any splash park, it's an accessible one. And this is really exciting because this RFP is all about accessibility. And how did this happen? Well, this came about from staff learning and doing research, including taking part in webinars and workshops that have been put on by their professional organizations, but also interaction with the community. So Trish mentioned the scroll about that we did with our accessibility committee, where we all met online and did a bit of a tour of our online environment. We also did a physical version where we met in person with lots of different folks with different disabilities, as well as staff, relevant staff, working on infrastructure and park and playground design and things like that. And we toured some of our facilities. We got in a handy dart together and rode around. And we took a look at the playground. And a couple of the folks that joined us have children with disabilities and one with complex needs. And the greatest thing was they were able to connect with staff members who were in the planning department getting ready to plan some playgrounds and actually talk to them, and not just talk to the parents, but meet the children and watch them use the current playgrounds and see what barriers there were. And so that's what was really special was, this RFP really came out of, staff initiative to learn about this stuff, but also connection with community members and, making that happen is really exciting. So I'll go to the next slide, please, Trish. Some other examples of things that are, in the works. So we're looking at inclusive facilities guidelines. Here at the District of Squamish, we have a lot of facilities that are going to need to be rebuilt soon. And yeah, like many organizations, I'm sure you also have inherited spaces and facilities and places that are not accessible. And, this is just the legacy of an ableist society. And so our job now is to make sure that any new builds are going to be different. So one thing that we're looking at is, building out these guidelines for accessibility. But I also wanted to bring in another thing that we're looking at is gender diversity. And this really comes up when we talk about bathrooms and change rooms, those very gendered spaces. So we're bringing in ideas about accessibility, making sure our bathrooms are accessible, but also making sure they're inclusive for people of multiple genders. So, you can have an accessible women's and accessible men's, but we want to make sure we also have, the space for those who maybe need a gender neutral or non-gendered area to use the bathroom or the change room that is accessible as well. And this brings up some of these key terms that you've heard of, I'm sure. Intersectionality. So some folks have multiple identities and, we want to make sure we're building for them as well. And multi-solving, which is this idea that we can solve multiple problems at once. When we're getting started building accessibility, let's also look at gender inclusivity. So that's another example. Accessible streetscapes guidelines. This has been in the works for a little while now, and it's about creating streetscapes that work for everyone. And with this one, I want to bring up the idea of standard. So reconsidering the idea of standard that actually could be a barrier. So thinking about standard bench heights or sidewalk width or just layouts in general don't always work for everyone. So if you build for the most marginalized people, you will actually benefit all. And this is known as the curb cut effect. Where back in the day, streetscapes didn't have any curb cuts. So people who use mobility devices like a wheelchair really struggled to get, off the sidewalk or up onto the sidewalk in a safe way. And once curb cuts went in, people noticed that, hey, it's not just folks using wheelchairs that are using them. A lot of different people are using them. I have young kids and I've pushed strollers around, and curb cuts are life-saving in a lot of ways. So that's the curb cut effect, the idea that if you build it for people with disabilities or the most marginalized group, you're going to benefit a lot of other folks as well. And finally, technology. So this is the idea of also, getting beyond the wheelchair. When we talk about disability, mobility is often something that comes up right away, and it is extremely important, but disabilities are vast and changing, and there's a lot of different ones. So one thing that's very personal to me is live caption. So considering, what's included in your communications platforms, are all your videos captioned? And of course, WCAG compliance for your own websites, but also those platforms that you contract to use. Next slide. So what's next for us? Well, as I mentioned, we'll be reviewing the policy with an accessibility lens, and possibly thinking about how we can look at accessible goods and services across the organization, making sure we're building those into our procurement. We're developing an implementation strategy for the plan itself. It's a very big plan, very pie in the sky, and we need to think about, what is going to be prioritized, and also thinking about procurement throughout that process as well. This is a really big point because this can be extremely overwhelming going through this process. And I want to reiterate that it doesn't have to happen overnight. Things are not going to change overnight. It's taken us a long time to get to this stage, but any new work should be accessible. So you have a lot of power in procurement to make sure that we're moving forward in the right way. Staff training and awareness is huge. Accessibility 101 for your organization is a great place to start. I'll do a shout out to Untapped Accessibility. There's lots of consultants and groups out there that are doing work on this, that are specializing in this and are able to help your staff come on board. So that's an important thing to do. We're also looking at the District of Squamish into this methodology of GBA+, which is called Gender-Based Analysis Plus. And it's a way for bringing these lenses into any project that you're looking at, that you're developing, to think, how is it going to affect different people? So you look at gender, you look at race, you look at ethnicity, and accessibility is a big part of that. So that might be something you want to look at as part of this work. I know the federal and provincial governments are starting to use this, so it's beneficial to get familiar with it because it will probably be showing up in grants as well. And finally, accessibility committees. If you're one of the prescribed organizations, you're going to have one, and they are an amazing resource, especially if you've got folks that have lived experience on the committee. So if you have one, I hope that you're able to use it and connect with these people. There are also a lot of accessibility experts that can be contracted as consultants. Find them and use them. That's something to consider building into your project management plans, building into your procurement processes. If you want to make sure that what you're building is accessible, there are consultants who can look at your plans and help with that. And finally, I just want to highlight, I think it's a good place to end actually, is this rallying cry of nothing about us without us. So as Trish mentioned, there's a shift in the way we're thinking about disability in the mainstream. And it's less to do with, the person is disabled because of, their body works differently. It's more about their interaction with the barrier, that actually society is made with a certain type of body in mind. And that any changes that need to be made should be made with the disability community, with folks who are disabled coming along. And that's where, this should be your mantra. And I hope that you're able to connect with folks in your community in some way to make sure you're getting their feedback. So I think we're near the end of time. So maybe Trish, if you want to just finish up with the presentation, I think we're at the end, and then we can open it up for questions.
Questions were the next thing, and I think Tori's going to take us through that. We did also want to share our email addresses to say you're welcome to reach out to us. So Trish at untappedaccessibility.ca and Kidner@squamish.ca, and I'll stop sharing the deck. So Tori, you can take us from here.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I think that was just so much information. And I think when we first started talking about this webinar, we were like, procurement and accessibility. What is that? When I came upon it in the Canada Accessibility Act, it's okay, but once you start to think it through, there's so many ways to start to explore this within the organization. I love the call out that procurement has so much power in these situations. We really want to go to that source when you're buying things, when you're making those design decisions. So let's involve procurement. I don't think we've got too many questions in the chat yet, but I have some questions. So just for full transparency, BiSocial Canada is working with Untapped Accessibility on their consulting services, looking at our own accessibility. And Trish, I think to share some honesty with everybody, we had a meeting last week and I was like, oh, this feels overwhelming. And I was a little bit resistant, there's so much to do. And I guess maybe I'd love to hear from both of you, how do you handle some of those resistances internally when people are managing so many different priorities, staff are busy, how do you kind of help people along on that journey to recognizing that this is possible and this is doable and it's something that we all need to be a part of contributing to?
Good question. Before the Accessible BC Act, I spent a lot of time convincing people with a business case and saying here are the reasons why you should employ people with disabilities, and this is you're missing out on 20% of the potential customer base if you don't make your product accessible. And then the Accessible BC Act came up, and for many organizations now I get to say it's legislation. You actually, I don't need to convince you. I need to help you figure out how to do it in a practical way. So a lot of the work that we're doing now is saying, okay, so what are you going to put into your accessibility plan? How do we take the feedback you're hearing from the community and from your internal staff and set it up in a way that is going to be manageable for you? And, balancing it with the fact that, that there is a lot to do, because as Keely said, we have all inherited a legacy of inaccessibility, but there's lots that can be done incrementally. And so it's about helping folks understand that. So even with BiSocial Canada, okay, let's take the 20-page document that we thought we were going to give you and boil it down to 3 key priorities, and then we'll build from there, especially because BiSocial Canada is doing this work and is not a prescribed organization. It's a values decision, not a compliance decision. So I would say there's plenty that we can do, and we can be practical, and it has to be balanced by your operational constraints and your internal processes in terms of the cadence of your organization. So that's where we can support organizations to come up with something that does feel doable. You don't have to become an accessibility expert in order to take action, improve accessibility for your community. You can get help with that. So Keely, what would you add to that?
Oh yeah, that's great. I would say the first thing is empathy. Everyone's really busy. it's hard. But I think that I'm trying to bring into this process a lot of celebration and joy. And I think if you kind of get people to understand that, I always say disabled people are the best life hackers. They know how to get around all the barriers because they've had to do it for so long. So the answers are there. We just need to connect with folks. So yeah, if we can bring that sort of celebration and excitement to, the fact that we're making good change in the world. And I also, I've said it today, it won't happen overnight. We've inherited this. It's taken a long time. Baby steps, we're gonna get there. And then the third thing is to really start building it into your processes. Every time you create a presentation or a document that has an image, just put an alt text in there, just do it. And it'll become normal. You're going to get better at it as you go on. And that is just, something that is just another little step that you take now to make sure that whatever you have is accessible to someone with a screen reader. And it's just little things like that. If you can start building them into the processes, it's going to become normal. We're very adaptable. Things feel normal very quickly. It just, takes the impetus to actually do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, when you're talking about that scroll about and the walkabout and having the design team and the engineers interact with kids who are trying to play on the playground. Like I think with social procurement, we're really recognizing the human elements and the relational elements of our economy and business that has been lacking into those things sometimes. And I think that really is so instrumental in showing people too, not just being like a concept, but something that's like, okay, you're actually connecting with somebody who's facing these barriers. Like, let's have some shared responsibility for making things better. And so to add maybe on your note there, Keely, about embedding it into your processes, we've got a question from Belginder. Is there anything you're doing to make a procurement process more accessible? So if we think about RFPs, bid documents, already barriered to even, somebody without any challenges or mental health or health disabilities, what are you doing on the procurement side?
I could say something really quickly, Trish, and then pass it over to you. So this is an excellent question, and I'm like taking notes that this is something we should look at the district. I know that there's a lot of systems that are like legacy systems out there in terms of how bids are put out, so that's a bigger issue. But I'll just say, like, from one example of experience I had, we actually hired someone in the summer to do a screen reader workshop with our staff. And it ties into your idea about like actually experiencing things for yourself. We can talk about putting in alt text for days and people are like, okay, sure, but why? I don't actually understand it. And so we hired a new Paula to come and online to do a screen reader workshop where she showed us how her screen reader works. And we got to listen to it, and she went through different documents. And I think for a lot of staff, it was like, oh, this is why, like, this is what happens when you don't do that. This is what happens when it's inaccessible. And then when it came time to pay her, our supplier form was actually not screen reader friendly. And so it was a really interesting example where I was like, okay, we've got to figure this out. And you have to be very humble. You have to be able to say, you know what? Yeah, this is not accessible to you. Let's figure out what we're going to do to make it more accessible. So I think a lot of times it's just, going through the process and getting that feedback. And being ready when you get that feedback to respond in a way that's actually going to make change, I guess.
One other thing I'd add to that is when we look at the UK, they in some ways are quite ahead in terms of government accessibility, and they have moved to using web pages, which are quite easy to make accessible versus a PDF for everything, because PDFs either need to be remediated or they won't be accessible. A kind of a mid-ground is you could be prepared to provide the RFP in just a simple Word document with not a lot of fancy images. It's very easy to make a Word doc just using the built-in accessibility checker to make it accessible, and that would be easier than going through the cost of remediating the PDF version. Or make sure that the next time you update your website, you build in accessibility requirements there so that any page you post is going to be accessible.
Great. Some great recommendations. And I know we're going to be tasked by Social Canada with using those accessibility checkers in Word and PowerPoint. So it's a good accessible tip for everybody to look at their accessibility, because most of us are using those types of word processing and documents. So we're almost at time here. We've got 2 more questions in the chat. So question askers and Trish and Keely, if you're able to stay on to answer those questions, that's great. But just being respectful of everyone's time and our schedules, I'm just going to wrap things up here. We do have some upcoming member trainings for BCSBI in January, December, and February. So there's a round of introduction, implementation, and construction trainings that starts in January, and we're partway through a round. So there's an implementation session in December and then the construction session in January. So please sign up for those if you're a BCSBI member and you want to learn more about social procurement. And I'd love to thank Keely and Trish so much for sharing all your expertise and knowledge and experience and wisdom with us today. I think it's really helpful to kind of break down something that can feel overwhelming and to really give so many tangible ways that people can start to look at accessibility into procurement. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. If anybody wants, Trish or Keely, are you able to stay on for some of those questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll stop share. Looks like we had one here, and I'll just keep kind of narrating here. Okay, we got thank yous. Are there any resources that list existing standards for BC for different types of projects?
I think the answer to that is there's nothing that comprehensively covers all aspects of accessibility. So I gave a few examples of some of the resources in terms of where you can find information about suppliers that maybe either are disability owned or are focused on employing people with disabilities. In the built environment, the Rick Hansen Foundation has a certification program for built environment. Internationally, we look at the WCAG for digital accessibility, but there's nothing in the legislation itself yet that gets that prescriptive. So this is all, you kind of have to go ad hoc by different aspects of accessibility to find if there is an international or national standard. Yeah, that's the best I can answer you. If you have particular types of accessibility in mind, you feel free to ask me a follow-up on that.
Great. Thanks, Trish. Anything from you, Keely? That all good? Okay. And then I think Haley's question might be answered through the accessibility committees. She asked, do you engage with those with different abilities to determine the needs as it relates to procurement and or projects? So that could be part of the accessibility committee, but maybe on a specific procurement or project. Is there a role for engaging with people with different abilities?
I think definitely, and I'll give an example of something that we're putting together now. So the great thing about the accessibility committee is you will make build those relationships, and that's crucial, right, in any of this work. And then you've got this, this group of people that you can connect with and invite out to, to engage on some of these projects. So one thing that we're doing right now is looking at accessible parking. So again, I really like having staff experience accessibility or disability or, inaccessibility. So we're organizing what I'm calling a park about. We're going with the theme here: roll about, scroll about, park about. In December, that basically we're going to meet with some folks in the community who use wheelchairs and drive, and we're just gonna go to a parking spot with them and try to park and see what kind of space they need. What are the barriers that they're seeing? We have excited staff. They're going to bring their measuring tapes. We've also developed some standards around this, and we're going to test to see if they work. So, this kind of thing is it's very useful, I find. So depending on the project, you could build something like that within. If you have a good relationship with people in the community, it's great. In order to build that relationship, I would say you need to compensate people. So that's a big discussion going on right now. How do we compensate the people on our committees who are spending their time, volunteer time, talking about things that might be very distressing, talking about accessibility barriers, and especially a group, that is one of the most, marginalized in terms of employment. So yeah, you need to make sure you're compensating people for their time and make it enjoyable and fun. I mean, it's going to be December, it's going to be snowy, I'm sure, but we're going to have hot chocolate and refreshments and just, try to have a good time and talk through this stuff. So I think on an ad hoc basis, once you've established those relationships, there's a lot of opportunity to bring people in and make it happen. I will say we're kind of, making this happen as we go. We haven't done this before, so we'll see what happens. But, I think there's definitely some opportunity there.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your leadership and for staying on and sharing and answering all these questions. It was a really great session. So glad you could be here with us today.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.